May 4th, 1945, Tyrol, Austria. The war was over for everyone except the men who hadn't realized it yet. In the small French-speaking town of Itter, SS troops were preparing to execute the last of their prisoners, politicians, generals, and civilians. And the only man standing between them and death was a German officer. Major Josef Gangl, once loyal to the Wehrmacht, would make a decision that no German soldier was supposed to make. He would fight with the Americans against his own army to save people the Reich called enemies. Before we begin the story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always incredible to see this community span across the world. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. The Surrender That Never Came. By the first days of May 1945, the Third Reich was already dead, it just hadn't fallen down yet. Berlin had burned. The Führer was gone. But in the mountains of Tyrol, deep in western Austria, small pockets of German troops still waited for orders that would never come. The radios were silent. The officers were ghosts. And the soldiers, tired, hungry, hollow, were fighting on instinct alone. Major Josef Gangl was one of them. A 35-year-old career artillery officer, he'd fought from France to the Eastern Front, earning the Iron Cross and scars that would never fade. But now, as the war crumbled around him, the medals meant nothing. The roads were full of refugees, the skies full of Allied planes, and the valleys full of frightened civilians who didn't know who to fear more, the enemy from outside, or the fanatics still loyal to Hitler from within. Gangl commanded a handful of men left from the Virgil Artillery Detachment, a unit that technically no longer existed. His orders, if they still mattered, were to hold the town and defend it to the last. But defend it from who? The Americans were approaching from the west. The SS were retreating from the east, burning villages and shooting deserters as they went. The people of Virgil had hung white flags from their windows, hoping someone would see them and spare them. That morning, Gangl watched from the town square as 2 SS trucks rolled in. Inside were black uniformed men, wild-eyed, desperate. They accused the mayor of treason for raising the white flags. One of them aimed his rifle at a school teacher who had tried to protect a group of children. Gangl intervened quietly but firmly. "The war is over," he said. "There's no need for this." The SS officer sneered. "For you, maybe. We don't surrender." The standoff lasted only seconds, but in that silence, everything changed. Gangl drew his pistol not on the Americans, not on the enemy, but on his own countrymen. The SS men backed off, cursing, and drove away. It was treason, mutiny, but it also saved lives. Later that day, the townspeople came to him. They begged him to stay, to protect them from the SS units who would soon return. Gangl looked at their faces, old men, women, children, none of them soldiers, and he knew what he had to do. He gathered his men in the town hall. "We were no longer fighting for Berlin," he said. "We were fighting for them." No one spoke for a long time. Then one of his sergeants nodded and said quietly, "Then we'll fight here." That night, as darkness fell over the valley, Gangl's small group of Wehrmacht soldiers began preparing for a battle. They didn't want a battle not for victory, but for decency. In the hills above them, a fortress loomed Itter Castle, and inside its stone walls were French prisoners awaiting execution by the same SS units Gangl had just defied. The next morning, he would have to make a choice no German officer had ever made before, whether to stay loyal to a dying Reich or to his conscience. Chapter 2. The Castle on the Hill. The road from Virgil to Itter Castle wound upward through the pine forests of Tyrol's steep, narrow, and eerily quiet. By the spring of 1945, that castle wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a prison, and inside it were some of the most valuable hostages in Hitler's collapsing empire. Among them were men whose names had once filled newspapers across Europe. Former French prime ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, generals, diplomats, even Charles de Gaulle's sister. They had been captured years earlier and kept alive, not out of mercy, but as bargaining chips, a human shield for a government that no longer existed. By May 3rd, the guards had fled. Only a few SS men remained, waiting for orders from a Reich that was already ash and silence. The prisoners huddled together in the castle's stone hall, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. Every explosion sounded closer. They knew the Americans were advancing from the west, but they also knew the SS were retreating from the east, killing anyone they considered a traitor along the way. If the SS reached them first, they would all die. That same day, Major Josef Gangl received a message from a member of the Austrian resistance. There are high-ranking French prisoners at Itter. The SS are coming to kill them. It should not have concerned him. A German officer had no reason to risk his life for French captives. But something in the message struck him not as a soldier, but as a man who had finally seen too much death. He gathered 10 of his remaining men. They had a few rifles, a light machine gun, and a single truck still running. It was suicide to face an SS detachment with that, and they all knew it. But Gangl said quietly, "If we don't help them, no one will." That night, under cover of darkness, he drove toward the castle, headlights off, following the moonlight along the dirt path. Halfway there, he encountered a group of Austrian partisans, young men and women armed with stolen rifles. They, too, had heard about the prisoners. Together, they climbed toward Itter, hearts pounding, every shadow a potential ambush. When they reached the gates, the scene was surreal. The French prisoners themselves were standing guard with captured weapons, their elegant suits replaced by tattered uniforms. A French general, seeing Gangl's German uniform, shouted, "Who are you? Another execution squad?" Gangl raised his hands. "No, I am here to keep you alive." But he knew it wasn't enough. His handful of men could never hold the castle against a full SS battalion. He needed help, and there was only one direction left to turn. To the west, the Americans were less than 10 kilometers away. Gangl decided to go himself. He took a white cloth, tied it to his truck's antenna, and drove straight toward enemy lines. Every minute, he expected to die shot by the SS from behind or by the Americans ahead who would mistake him for an ambush. When he finally saw the first Allied tank, he stopped, climbed out, and raised his hands. A young U.S. sergeant aimed his rifle and shouted, "Don T, move!" Gangl replied, in broken English, "French prisoners, SS coming. Need help." They brought him to Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr., commander of a Sherman tank platoon. Lee listened in disbelief. "You are telling me a German officer wants to fight with us against the SS?" Gangl nodded once. "Yes, tonight, or they die." Lee didn't hesitate. He pointed to his tank crew and said, "Then let S go save some Frenchmen." That night, something happened that had never happened before or since in the Second World War. A German Wehrmacht officer and an American tank commander prepared to fight side by side, not as enemies, but as allies. One tank, a few trucks, and a handful of men driving into the mountains together to defend a castle full of prisoners from a common enemy. The last battle of the war, and perhaps the only one, fought for the right reasons. Chapter 3. When enemies became allies. Just after dawn on May 5, 1945, the rumble of an American Sherman tank echoed through the mountain road toward Itter Castle. Inside the tank was Captain John Jack Lee Jr., a 30-year-old from Pennsylvania, and behind him, riding in an open German truck, was Major Josef Gangl, still wearing his Wehrmacht uniform. For a few seconds, even Lee's men couldn't believe what they were seeing. A German officer sitting beside an American, giving directions to a castle full of French prisoners. One of the gunners muttered, "Sir, you sure this isn't a setup?" Lee just said, "Not this time. I can tell when a man asks done with killing." When they reached the castle gates, the prisoners were waiting anxious, armed with old rifles they'd taken from the guards who fled. Among them, General Maurice Gamelin and Prime Minister Reynaud stood in disbelief at the sight of a German and an American shaking hands. "Monsieur," Gangl said in broken French, "help has arrived from both sides." Lee climbed out of his tank and looked around. The castle walls were high, but cracked. The main gate hung off its hinges. Down in the valley, black smoke marked the approach of SS troops, more than 100 of them. They were coming to wipe out the prisoners, anyone who defied the Reich, and any soldier who had switched sides. For the next few hours, the defenders prepared for a battle that should never have happened. 10 American soldiers, 14 German Wehrmacht volunteers, a handful of French prisoners, former generals, ministers, and a tennis player who had once won Wimbledon, all arming themselves together. They placed the Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, at the main gate, its turret facing downhill. Gangl ordered his men to cover the flanks from the towers, while the French improvised barricades using tables, bookshelves, and broken doors. Inside, Captain Lee joked dryly, "You realize, Major, this has to be the strangest alliance in history." Gangl smiled faintly. Strange, but perhaps the right one. As the sun rose, the sound of distant gunfire rolled up the valley. The SS were coming 150 men with machine guns and mortars. Inside the castle, the defenders took their positions. An American gunner loaded the Sherman-S cannon and said quietly, "Guess we're fighting World War II's weirdest battle." Lee replied, "Maybe the last one too." Gangl moved along the wall, checking positions. He looked every bit the officer he had always been: calm, decisive, methodical. But this time, his orders were not for conquest, but for protection. He told his men, "No one fires unless the SS do first. We are here to defend, not destroy." When the first SS troops appeared through the trees, the tank opened fire, the shell exploding at the front of their column, scattering the attackers into the woods. The air filled with smoke and shouting, the clang of rifle fire against stone, the echo of grenades rolling down the slope. And through it all, 2 flags fluttered from the tower, one white, one American. Inside, a French officer turned to another and said, "Mon Dieu, I never thought I'd live to see Germans and Americans fighting side by side." The other replied, "Perhaps the war is finally ending." By noon, the castle walls were trembling under the assault. A German machine gun jammed. The tank was running low on shells. And somewhere on the upper floor, a window shattered as an SS sniper took aim. Major Gangl saw him and ran into the open to protect one of the French prisoners. The shot hit him in the neck. He collapsed instantly. The Frenchman he had shielded, former Prime Minister Reynaud, knelt beside him and whispered, "You saved us all." Gangl's last words were barely audible. Then it was worth it. The battle continued for hours after his death, until American reinforcements arrived and the SS scattered into the forest. When it was over, the defenders, Germans, Americans, and French, stood together in silence over the body of the man who had united them. He was the only casualty of the battle, and the last German officer to die fighting against the SS. Chapter 4. The Battle of Castle Itter. By noon on May 5, 1945, the hills around Itter Castle were alive with gunfire. The SS had surrounded the fortress, 150 men from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, desperate and fanatical, determined to erase any trace of traitors. Inside the castle walls were fewer than 30 defenders, 10 Americans, 14 Germans, and a handful of French prisoners clutching rifles they barely knew how to use. The clash was chaos and disbelief all at once, Allies and Axis, shoulder to shoulder, firing down on the same enemy. The Sherman tank besotten. Jenny roared from the gate, its cannon thundering across the valley. Each shot blasted chunks of stone and earth, forcing the SS to scatter behind trees and ruined farmhouses. The sound echoed for miles, a single tank standing between freedom and slaughter. From the tower, a French general called out enemy positions in perfect German. Below him, a Wehrmacht private tossed extra ammunition to an American gunner. Somewhere near the courtyard, a captured SS machine gun rattled to life this time, firing for the Allies. Even as bullets shattered windows and splintered doors, the defenders refused to give up ground. They fought from stairwells, from the balconies, from behind overturned tables. Smoke filled the castle halls, mixing with the acrid stench of gunpowder and burning timber. By early afternoon, ammunition was running low. The Sherman S gun jammed after firing its last round. The defenders had only rifles and grenades left, and the SS were closing in. An American sergeant yelled, "We out of shells!" Captain Lee gritted his teeth. "Then we'll fight like it. 1776. Hold the damn castle." Gangl's men, the former Wehrmacht soldiers, held the right wall, firing until their barrels glowed. One of them, bleeding from the arm, shouted to the Americans, "We fight together. No surrender." And from somewhere above, one of the French officers, still wearing his tattered overcoat, laughed through the chaos. "Mon Dieu, we are truly allies now." When the SS tried to storm the main gate, the defenders detonated grenades from the second floor. The explosion tore through the courtyard, scattering debris and men alike. Still, the attackers came again, relentless, hopeless, furious. Inside, Captain Lee crouched by the window, peering through the smoke. He could see movement down the hill, dust clouds, engines, and a faint glint of armor. American reinforcements. He stood up, bellowing over the noise. "They were coming. Hold just a little longer." The defenders rallied for one final push. Every rifle, every pistol, every last bullet fired into the smoke below. Then, at last, the unmistakable rumble of more Shermans rolling into the valley. The SS broke. Those who weren't killed fled into the woods, dropping their weapons as American reinforcements surrounded the castle. When the firing stopped, silence returned to the Tyrolean mountains, a silence so total it felt unreal. Inside the courtyard, the surviving defenders stood together, covered in dust and blood, staring at one another. French officers, American tankers, German soldiers, former enemies, now bound by something war had almost erased humanity. They carried Major Josef Gangl's body out to the sunlight, laid him beneath a white sheet near the gate he had died defending. Captain Lee saluted. General Reynaud murmured, "He died as a soldier of peace." The Battle of Castle Itter was the only time in history that Americans and Germans fought side by side against the SS. It lasted barely half a day, but it said more about courage, loyalty, and conscience than 1,000 victories. In the official records, it was noted as a small skirmish in Austria, but for the men who were there, it was the end of the war, and in a way, the beginning of reconciliation. Epilogue. The last German hero. When the guns fell silent that evening, Itter Castle stood half-ruined, its walls pocked with bullet holes, its courtyard blackened by fire. But it had survived, so had the prisoners, and so, in a way, had the idea that even in the final hours of a collapsing world, a man could still choose what was right. Major Josef Gangl, was buried in the nearby village of Vurgel, under a simple cross marked with his name and rank. There were no military honors, no marching bands, no swastikas draped in mourning. Only the people he had saved, Austrian civilians, French prisoners, and American soldiers standing side by side. An American officer placed his cap over his heart. A French general saluted, and the local priest whispered a single line. He fought not for victory, but for humanity. In the years that followed, the story of Castle Itter almost disappeared. To many historians, it sounded too unbelievable. Americans and Germans fighting together, defending French hostages against the SS. It didn't fit neatly into any narrative of the war, but those who had been there never forgot. Captain Jack Lee returned home to the United States, a decorated hero, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. He rarely spoke about the battle, except to say, "I fought beside a German that day, and he was one hell of a soldier." In Austria, Josef Gangl became something rare. A German officer remembered not for his obedience, but for his conscience. Schools in Tyrol, Siegen, named streets after him. A plaque in Vurgel reads, "He died so that others might live, May 5th, 1945. As for the French prisoners, they returned to their homeland to find it in ruins, but they carried with them a story of redemption. In their memoirs, they wrote not of politics or revenge, but of a German who refused to be part of the evil he was born into. They called him Le Bon Allemand, the Good German. Today, Castle Itter still stands in the Austrian Alps. The walls are scarred, the courtyard quiet. But if you stand there in the wind, you can almost hear the echoes, the clash of rifles, the rumble of the tank, the shouted orders in 3 languages. And somewhere in that memory, the faint voice of a man who crossed the line between duty and decency. Because in the last days of the Third Reich, when almost everyone else was obeying, one German disobeyed and saved the very people he was told to hate. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.